Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wist. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Hello, Travis Crawford. You've written and talked a lot about film over the years, and today we will be chatting about George Romero's film, Night of the Living Dead. Before we get into that, would you please tell me about COVID-19 affecting your life?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I think if you talk to a lot of writers or any other, creative people that tend to work from home a lot anyway, it's not as much of a disruption of daily routine as it is for a lot of other people, I'm sure. I think it's more you realize how much you would like to get away from writing and working at home when you don't have the option of doing it.
Mhm.
It's like there are a lot of days where it would not have occurred to me to, go out and go to a restaurant and do whatever. But then when the option is taken from you, you find yourself going stir crazy, even though you would not have thought twice about having a normal day like that, if you hadn't had to be restricted. So there's that. I mean, again, I mean, writing from home, watching films, reading, everything. I mean, that's recording and everything is stuff that's sort of hermetic anyway.
Hmm.
And, so my existence a lot of times is just, all right, go to the store and get groceries. And now just do that with a mask on. So it hasn't been as, terrible for me as obviously it has for a lot of other people. So I've been lucky.
Well, that's good to know. You're like one of the lucky ones. So,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
at what stage of life did you watch The Night of the Living Dead, and how did it affect you?
It's interesting. I think I saw it relatively early on TV on UHF, if anyone remembers what that even means.
Mhm.
On some late night creature feature type program because it used to air on those things relatively frequently. I'm sure you're aware of, the public domain status of the film. The copyright issues meant that it could be terrible quality copies could be, aired on various stations and it could be sold for $1.99 at Kmart in a VHS bin back then, in the early days of
Hmm.
video. I don't remember the first experience seeing that as much as I remember years later the first experience of seeing Dawn of the Dead, because it was one of the first. That was one of the first films that I rented when I was 14, and my family got the first VCR that we had. So that stands out very vividly. Night of the Living Dead, I feel like I saw it at a probably inappropriately young age, and then kind of learned to love it and appreciate it again and rediscover it as an adult after Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, oddly enough.
Please tell me about the use of music in Night of the Living Dead.
It's fantastic. Profoundly eerie and creepy, and does a wonderful job of setting the mood. And it's interesting because that's one of those Romero films that does not have an original music score. He was using needle drop cuts, basically like library music, stock music that he would buy for a set fee of existing music, some of which had been used in late 50s, early 60s films. I think there are tracks from The Hideous Sun Demon in there, some of which had been used in late 50s, early 60s TV crime shows. And at that point, it was just part of a library of music cues that he was able to purchase for cheap and put in the film, although they're somewhat electronically altered and augmented in their use in the film. But I think it's interesting. I mean, not only does, and I think Romero was big on that. He did that for a couple films, even Dawn of the Dead, which has a famous score by the Italian group Goblin that worked with Dario Argento frequently, still contains quite a lot of stock library music in the film
Hmm.
as well. So, I mean, even when given the option of using an original score, sometimes Romero would still default to the library cues that he loved. And I think he does that really well. That's also the case with Cronenberg and his first couple commercial features, Shivers and Rabid. Makes excellent use of library stock cues. I think in Night of the Living Dead too, it's interesting because they were taken from previous use in late 50s, early 60s science fiction and horror movies and TV shows. I think it forms kind of an interesting sonic bridge between an older type of genre film and TV, an older type of more traditional monster movie, and what Night of the Living Dead was actually creating for a very contemporary 70s horror movie. So it's sort of like you have the imagery of something that was very progressive in what it was doing for the genre, with the soundtrack being something that kind of looked back on monster films of the past. I think it's very effective.
So Dwayne Jones, the lead of the movie, is black and was cast by George in the late '60s simply because he thought he was the best actor who auditioned.
Right.
How did George's attitude contrast with the audience reception of that decision?
It's interesting. I mean, I've read later interviews with Romero where he said that, he and his Image 10 partners in the making of Night of the Living Dead, when they cast Jones, who was originally written in the script to be kind of a burly, working class, blue collar truck driver guy, not specified as white, but sort of assumed as such then. And then when they cast Jones, who's an incredibly sort of intelligent, literate, sensitive, intellectual guy, Jones did suggest some dialogue changes because there were some sort of gruff things that he would have been saying in the original Ben character that he thought, were not really going to be organic to who he was. But other than that, Romero said that he and his partners thought that it was kind of a great thing to not change the character at all, to leave Ben be essentially the same as had been originally written. But I read an interview with him where later he said he wonders if maybe they kind of missed an opportunity there, that perhaps the character could have been shaped even more to tap into, because obviously when you see Night of the Living Dead, and particularly some of the climactic imagery in the film with, the posse and the dogs, and you're thinking of a lot of newsreel images you see of civil rights protests and violence that erupted just a few years earlier in the 60s. And Romero had said that he wondered if maybe they maybe should have acknowledged that a little bit more with the character. But at the time, they thought it was very progressive to not change the character of Ben and not acknowledge that, which in a way, I think that's very powerful and effective too. So, yeah.
So tell me about the use of social commentary in this movie, besides that decision.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that really distinguishes Romero's work is the social commentary, and, obviously the satire of consumerism in Dawn of the Dead is probably the most obvious example that everyone remembers. It feels very organically ingrained in the material. It doesn't feel like it's something that's been grafted on to try to give the movie more leverage or weight or meaning that it really should. It seems very natural. It doesn't seem like subtext so much as it seems like text, but in a way that's handled very naturally and very unselfconsciously for the most part. Again, I think that that's probably most effective in Dawn of the Dead. And I see a lot of horror films now where I think perhaps reacting to the fact that Romero's films, the zombie films in particular, were so critically lauded because they had additional layers to them, that I feel that a lot of horror filmmakers now very self-consciously insert those layers, and insert that kind of social subtext and satire in a way that feels very forced. Whereas in the Romero films, like I said, it feels very natural to me. Night of the Living Dead, I don't think is as rich with that as Dawn of the Dead. But I think that, again, I think it's more of a reflection on the society, that post-civil rights, Vietnam War era society of the late 60s and the sort of social turmoil that was going on at that time. I think it's more of a reflection of that, sometimes just in the way that the film tells its story than is necessarily there in overt themes or dialogue or anything like that.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Is it safe to say that Night of the Living Dead became the blueprints for do-it-yourself horror filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching an interview with John Carpenter, and he was talking about the second film that he made in 1976, Assault on Precinct 13, and they asked him, which has kind of a similar characters in an isolated setting under siege kind of plot as Night of the Living Dead, and the interviewer asked him, were you influenced by Night of the Living Dead? And Carpenter quipped, everyone was influenced by Night of the Living Dead, and if they say they weren't, they're lying. I think that certainly Night of the Living Dead was a massive influence on the horror films, and not just horror. I mean, other genre films and low budget films that came after that. And I think in a lot of ways, looking at it from like a broader sense, even the fact that when Night of the Living Dead came out, because Night of the Living Dead, as much as I love the film and have nothing but admiration for that and Romero's career, I'm not going to argue that it reinvented the wheel. I mean, there certainly were other independent low budget horror films that preceded it in the 60s that were doing similar things, but not with that degree of intelligence and accomplishment and everything else that Romero and his team brought to it. And when the film became critically noticed and then a success on the midnight movie circuit, and the 70s evolved into the cult film that it's remained, I think that that was something that helped filmmakers after it. I always refer to the big five in terms of North American horror of that period as Romero, Carpenter, Cronenberg, Tobe Hooper, and Wes Craven. And I think that when those other directors made their debuts, I think they may have had Night of the Living Dead in mind, not in terms of the specific storyline, although that comes into play in some of their films too, but just in the way that the film was taken seriously. It showed that a horror film made regionally, in Pittsburgh on a low budget, could be something that could garner serious critical reception and not something that was just going to be relegated to the second or third feature in a drive-in all-nighter.
Yeah, I guess Herschel Gordon Lewis with Blood Feast kind of started it. Yeah,
right.
But Night of the Living Dead actually has some charisma, or more. They want to make a good movie a bit more, or
right.
Leave in the material.
I got to give Herschel Gordon Lewis all the credit in the world for Blood Feast and 2000 Maniacs. But I mean, as he himself, I think the quote he made was, Blood Feast is kind of like a Walt Whitman poem. It's not any good, but it's the first of its kind, and so I think that you do have to go, well, I mean, he was doing it years earlier with a regional horror film, but I don't think anyone would seriously compare Blood Feast, as a good film to Night of the Living Dead, entertaining as it is. So, yeah.
It is a fun movie, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so could you talk about movies that came before Night of the Living Dead that use zombies, and maybe which ones influenced Romero?
Well, I think some of the films that influenced Romero were not specifically zombie movies. I mean, if you look at how zombies were treated prior to Night of the Living Dead, you had films that relied more on voodoo origins, like the Val Lewton production, I Walked with a Zombie, which is actually my favorite Lewton film. If you want to go back even further into 32, I believe, the Bela Lugosi film White Zombie. But it wasn't, again, it was usually either connected with voodoo or connected with sort of a mad scientist who was using an individual zombie, to do his maniacal bidding. It wasn't sort of the army of the undead thing. I think when you look at more direct influences on Night of the Living Dead, you have The Last Man on Earth, the Vincent Price film, which is adapted from the same Richard Matheson story, I Am Legend, that Romero cites as an uncredited direct influence on Night of the Living Dead. I don't remember if Last Man on Earth, they're not called zombies, if they're referenced at all. I think it's actually more of a vampire mythos type thing, but they're still what we would identify as, the undead in an apocalyptic situation. And then also Romero himself has acknowledged that a big influence is the Herc Harvey film Carnival of Souls, also from the early 60s. Again, those are not zombies so much as they are sort of generically undead ghouls, but the tone and imagery of that film was, I think, also a big influence on Romero and Night of the Living Dead.
Oh, that's stuff for people to check out.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So I would love for you to give us a little tease for your upcoming audio commentary track for the upcoming Dawn of the Dead Blu Ray release.
Yeah, it's being done by Second Sight Films in the UK. It is going to be a UK only release. People in the US on social media were freaking out just a few days ago when it was announced that Second Sight was only shipping within the UK. But I think that people outside the UK might be able to find other means of obtaining it through other retailers and such, hopefully. I'm in the middle of doing it now. I'm actually a little behind schedule, which is giving me a panic attack as I think about it.
Hmm.
But, hopefully it will delve into the entire Romero body of work as well as specifics, pertaining to Dawn of the Dead and the production of that film. The production has been pretty exhaustively chronicled, so I don't want to detail too much in the commentary track that's going to be repetitive overkill for people. So I'm going to be going off on a lot of different tangents, just about the changing face of the mall and the American landscape, over the decades, and how malls have kind of become, ironically, they're now called zombie malls, these empty malls that have been abandoned by consumers. So I'll be talking a lot about that and a lot of other things. It's also the 5th commentary I've done for a Romero film. I've done There's Always Vanilla, Season of the Witch, The Crazies, and Monkey Shines. So, I don't want to assume that people listening to the Dawn commentary have heard any of the other ones, but I also don't want to dwell too much on some of the same territory I've already covered in the other commentaries too. So hopefully it will come together and be an interesting listen.
Wow, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
And those other tracks, they were for Arrow Video, except for Monkey Shines?
Right. Monkey Shines was only on the UK Blu Ray by Eureka Entertainment, and the other 3 were for Arrow, and they're available in both the UK and the US and Canada.
Fantastic. I hope people check them out.
Yeah.
How do you think Day of the Dead stands beside Night and Dawn?
Well, you may be getting an unpopular opinion on this one because Day of the Dead is not only my favorite of Romero's Dead films, it's actually my favorite Romero film, period.
Wow.
Yeah, and I know that doesn't tend to be. I remember there's a little documentary featurette on one of the previous video releases of Day of the Dead, and he was talking about how you have the traditional, Romero was saying how you have the traditionalists that really love the original Night of the Living Dead, and all the people that like to party with Dawn of the Dead because it's sort of the most overtly fun and was the biggest hit. And then he said, then you have the real trolls that like Day of the Dead. And I know it was his favorite, at least of the original trilogy. I don't know if he changed his mind with the Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, Survival of the Dead, the final films he did. Yeah, so Day is my favorite. I know that it's very talky and claustrophobic, and it lacks the sort of groundbreaking landmark nature of the first 2. But it just has a kind of grim, downbeat, fatalistic tone to it that I really appreciate. And not that you look for realism in a zombie movie, but I think that the mood of the film is the most appropriately apocalyptic. It has like I said, a downbeat quality to it that works really well for me. Although, again, I love the first 2 as well. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to say what others have said before and say you're crazy.
I know. I hear it a lot. So
Yeah.
it's like I said, it is definitely a minority opinion, and also not one that I had for years. For years, Dawn was my favorite one, and then as I sort of watched them again over the years, let me put it this way: I found myself going back to Day more often than Dawn. But that's why I'm also careful to use the term favorite instead of best when talking about this stuff.
Sure.
It's like Day is my personal favorite. That doesn't necessarily mean I think it's the best one. So.
Well, fair enough. We'll let you off with that.
Yeah,
Travis,
there you go.
thanks for your time. May you please tell me what you have planned for the rest of the year before I let you go?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm working on a couple of commentary tracks in addition to the Dawn of the Dead one that should be announced shortly. Doing a couple booklet essays for Blu Rays, and then I'm really excited about the fact, and this has just sort of come together in the last couple of weeks, I'm going to be moving from providing special features to Blu Rays to actually working on film acquisitions and production of Blu Ray special editions for a label. And I guess I can't say anything more about that label just yet because I'm afraid of jinxing it, since the T's haven't been crossed and the I's haven't been dotted on everything. But that should be the next step I'll be taking soon.
Well, that's very exciting, and I wish you lots of luck.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.
Thank you.